I'm Kraettli Epperson. I'm the CEO of Vigilant Aerospace, and I'm going to be moderating our panel discussion with some industry leaders on the polarizing effects of remote ID for the drone and UAS industry, what remote ID means, the status of the emerging remote ID rule, which the FAA has put out a notice of public rulemaking that's been extensively commented on. We're going to have an opportunity for these panelists to talk to us about remote ID generally, how it's going to impact the industry, and then we'll have some time for questions as we get to the mid part of this panel discussion. A couple of things here. As you ask questions, please be sure to put them into the chat. That's where we're going to pull the questions from. And I'll be trying to monitor that, so give us a few minutes and we'll try and catch your questions. And we'll start doing that about midway through the session. So this goes from 11 to 11:50. And I am just going to give us a couple of minutes here for people to join as we get a minute or two after the 11 o'clock hour. All right. People are joining. Very good. Again, this is the remote ID session. We have a panel, and we're going to talk about the implications of remote ID, including the new FAA rule that's been proposed. And then we're going to talk about the technology and the commercial implications as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm Kraettli Epperson. I'm moderating. I'm the CEO of Vigilant Aerospace. We're based in Oklahoma City, and we have people and operations throughout the U.S. Around our airspace safety products. I have with me several distinguished leaders in the industry representing a variety of companies. We have Trever Linn, who's the Director of Airspace Integration at Iris Automation. And Trever has also, I know in the past, had a policy role in Kansas, and hopefully he'll be able to talk with us about a wide range of things. We have Ted Lester, who's the Chief Technologist at AiRXOS. I'm very happy to have Ted with us. Ted has been very involved in helping to write standards for UAS technologies and is going to take us through a little bit of what the emerging technical standards for remote ID look like. We have John Hegranes. Have I said that right, John?
That was lovely.
Excellent, thank you. So he's the founder and CEO of Kittyhawk, very widely respected software company that has applications for helping to manage drones, provide UTM, Lance, and other functions. So we'll be delighted to hear about John's experiences. And then we have Tyler Collins from Precision Hawk. Tyler is involved in solutions for the energy industry at Precision Hawk. And so I know that he'll bring us some practical experience with the need for remote ID and how it might be used in the industry. All right, so I want to get started here just talking a little bit about what remote ID is. And so, John, I'm going to start out with you. If you can just give us a brief overview, description of what remote ID is.
Yeah, thanks, Kraettli. So remote ID can mean a lot of different things depending on who you ask, depending on when you ask them. When we first started providing remote ID technologies to our customers about 3 years ago, they wanted to see where their drones were flying. They wanted to remotely identify where their drones were in the sky. It was very specific to their operation. I think the tricky part with remote ID is there's now a couple of different definitions. We have a technology use case, but we also have a compliance and regulatory piece of remote ID. Unfortunately, we don't have two different terms for it. So whether you're looking through the FAA lens or you're an operator trying to improve your operations, it's the same term. You're trying to see where drones are in the sky.
Right. So that's the fundamental function and need is to know where they are. Trever, I want to ask you, what is the what's the implication of having remote ID technologies for the industry?
That's a good question. So we know from the Reauthorization Act that some sort of UTM architecture is going to be required. So what that is going to look like in the long term, we don't know. We know the first step is this remote ID, like John said, is really just knowing who's flying the drone, where it's at, so that we can track bad actors, participants, and really get that base infrastructure in there for UTM. And then we also know from future NPRMs that are coming out for operations over people at night, the FAA really sees this as the first step towards getting advanced operations approved. So to transition into that environment where we're flying beyond visual line of sight, where we're flying over people, we need to know who's flying, what's flying, and be able to process that data and use it in a meaningful way.
So Trevor, you mentioned UTM. Explain to us what that is real briefly.
Yep, so UTM is unmanned traffic management. You can think of it as the ATC for the drone world, essentially. At some level, we need to be able to control and integrate drones into the airspace, and so you're going to have to have authorization to take off in certain airspaces. A good preamble to UTM is the LANCE, which is low altitude authorization notification capability that John and his company and other ones like AirMap have been using for a long time. The same structure is going to be used, hopefully, for remote ID.
Excellent. Something I want to make sure that we mention before we get too far from our introduction of remote ID is that remote ID, I think in the industry, is seen as something that law enforcement in particular was concerned about as we consider having beyond visual line of sight flight of drones. With the idea being that if we can identify a drone, identify the operator, then the safety of having drones flying overhead all the time where there's no evident operator, somebody who's standing over there operating it, which is kind of how it works now for most small commercial drones at least, a rule like this will enable that. So I think that rule for public safety is important to mention when we talk about remote ID, because that's, I think, part of where it emerged from. Does anybody have any experience with that or insight on that origination?
Kraettli, I think that's a very good point to bring up, and public safety is one of our big clients at AiRXOS, and they really do see it as important for them. I mean, it's the same way that license plates help the safety on the roads, because they hold people accountable and they allow bad actors to be identified. And so the thinking, as we get more and more beyond visual line of sight flights, ops over people, these more advanced operations in the future, that remote ID is really that enabling technology that helps with the safety by holding the operators accountable, so that everyone knows that the flights overhead are approved and are being approved by the FAA and are safe, and that if people are acting up, there's a way to identify who they are, or at least see that they're not doing remote ID and they stand out, so that appropriate measures can be taken.
Excellent. So Ted, on that note, I want to transition to another slide here and have you talk with us a little bit further. Let me get this slide up here. So this is a diagram that Ted provided that is from the ASTM remote ID standard. So Ted, tell us just a little bit about what a technical standard is, and then maybe go through this diagram and we'll have some discussion about this.
Yeah, sure thing. So ASTM is a standards development organization, and they do standards for all sorts of things, from, I think, things like smoke detectors and fire extinguishers, oil viscosities, and they're starting to take a role in the aviation world. They did some of the light sport aircraft standards that the FAA has adopted to enable light sport aircraft in the market. And more recently, they've really started to focus on UAS standards. And so one of those standards that they've created under the F-38 committee is on remote ID and tracking. And so this standard was published back in February-ish of this year. It was a culmination of probably 2 years worth of work developing a standard, and it's an industry consensus standard. So lots of people got together and kind of worked with the FAA, with other stakeholders, with public safety stakeholders, to develop kind of a technology standard for remote ID that's applicable ideally worldwide, because the drone manufacturers want to have systems that they can sell worldwide. We want to have interoperable technologies for, eventually when drones start flying longer distances and cross borders. And so this standard was meant to be applicable in Europe and US and Canada, with a regulatory overlay that like the FAA here in the US would apply to how you implement this kind of more generic standard in the US. And so that's how it's structured, and it really covers 3 types of remote ID. The most basic one shown here at the top of the slide is broadcast remote ID, which uses either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi to share the drone's position with nearby people on the ground. And then, the public can use just a basic, cell phone that can receive those Bluetooth and Wi-Fi signals to see, who's operating the drones overhead, what's their license plate number. So that's kind of the simple implementation. The next layer is the networked remote ID, where drones share their position with a service supplier. So Kittyhawk would be one of those service suppliers that would then take that position and share it with display providers. So you really have a marketplace of both service providers and display providers kind of in this federated architecture where, customers on both sides, both the drone users and the people with, mobile devices or websites that want to show remote ID information can have multiple choices of who to use. They'll get that display information and then again can share it on the mobile phones or back in an ops center. And combine it with some of that broadcast information. So really can help with that identification. And then the final one is non-equipped network participants. And this is where, a hobbyist drone that doesn't have a GPS, they just want to fly it with a stick and rudder on their controller, wants to fly a drone. All they have to do is use one of these service providers to say, hey, I'm flying in this field between this time and this time. And then that information gets shared. So again, when, a police officer or the general public is concerned about somebody flying nearby, they can say, oh, that's John. They wouldn't have his name, but they would say, oh, that's someone who's registered. There's an identification number associated with them, and they've let everyone know they're flying in this field between this start time and end time, and therefore they're a legitimate flyer. So that's the concept. The FAA also has kind of one other notion of, they call them in the proposed rulemaking for remote ID, federally recognized identification areas, or FRIAs, which is basically an area that as long as you stay within, you don't have to do any type of remote ID. So that's kind of even maybe a 4th type, is just, there'll be areas where drone operations are allowed without any remote ID as long as they stay within that area.
Right, and that's more of like a hobbyist field that's dedicated for model aircraft. And yeah, so we'll probably come back around to this diagram. I had one question before we go on and talk a little bit about industry implications, and then we'll definitely leave this up and talk through this because I think it provides a lot of background info. But in the top broadcast model, the drone itself is sending out a radio signal continuously with its remote ID information. And we'll talk maybe a little later about what that exactly includes. In the middle here, networked, it's actually using the flight controller or a piece of software to send that information. It's not sending it directly from a radio that you could literally pick up from a ground device, from your phone, for example. It's sending it to a central database that you could pick it up from by saying, there's somebody near me, I'm going to go query the database. So those are they're very different ways to do the same thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they kind of have pros and cons. The broadcast works very well, maybe in areas where you don't have good cell phone service, kind of more remote areas. The problem is it has very limited range. As everyone knows, trying to get a Wi-Fi signal can sometimes be tough when you're even just, right outside your house. And so there are some range limitations of the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Which kind of limit broadcast. In rural areas, that's less of an issue. So in more urban areas and denser areas, the network has the advantage of, being able to use any network. So whether, use cell phone, use Wi-Fi, there are lots of different ways you can control your drone and get that information, to the controller, share that across basically the internet, which is kind of depicted by that orange cloud there. And then anyone else with an internet, connection can then query that information. So you're not as dependent on the kind of radio line of sight that you would with the broadcast system.
Right. Right. Good. All right. So we'll leave this diagram up. So I wanted to jump to Tyler, and I'd be very interested, Tyler, if you could talk to us a little bit about how remote ID is likely to impact industry and the use of unmanned aircraft.
Yeah, so I think when you talk about the impact of industry and remote ID, people talk about both positives and negatives. And so I think we can talk through what both of those look like and ultimately how they interface with each other. So from an industry perspective, the way at least we think about it on the enterprise side is very focused around large companies who want to roll out very large fleets of drones. So in the case of the companies Precision Hawk works with, those are typically large electric utility companies or large oil and gas companies who are trying to inspect infrastructure across a very, very wide area. In some cases, hundreds of thousands of distribution poles across entire states, or even what's happening in California, inspection of transmission structures across the entire state. And so talking about why remote ID is important and how that helps the enterprise business, the challenge that we face today is the limitation of regulation for those advanced operations. So although some utilities are building very large fleets of drones in the hundreds of pilots, the hundreds of UAS, what we're seeing is we're still very limited to being able to operate in mostly rural areas within visual line of sight, and not being able to access 100% of their systems just due to those restrictions. And so, to reflect what Trevor was saying earlier, is remote ID really being a stepping stone into more advanced operations. That's how we really look at remote ID. Remote ID is going to help us continue to add various levels of safety to the safety cases that we're developing around the operations that we're creating today, to enable these companies to be able to go and potentially in the near future leverage remote ID as well as other technologies within these safety cases to be able to enable those more advanced operations. And those may be beyond line of sight, probably starting in more rural areas, because we can start to get to impacting what well clear is around manned aircraft and drones by being able to report in position of those aircraft in both directions, as well as being able to start working towards safely operating in more dense and urban areas, which today on the utility side is very difficult to operate in, and in most cases they're not able to operate at all today. So from a benefit side, that's where we look at remote ID actually being able to really impact an industry, because it's going to allow us to be much more efficient, much more safe, and much more effective with how the operations of these large data collection programs are really taking place. And of course, with that, there is going to be a cost increase, because now in order to equip UAS with remote ID, those UAS are going to have some kind of equipment on them, right? Whether it's the local broadcast or the network solution, there's going to be additional cost. However, the way that we look at that, by incorporating remote ID into these safety cases and the benefits of being able to open up more advanced operations, very likely the impact made by the higher level of efficiency of those more advanced operations will likely outweigh the cost associated with equipping remote ID to those fleets.
So Tyler, you said something I wanted to draw out a little bit more. There is a challenge with operating unmanned aircraft in urban areas right now that you think remote ID will help with. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, and when I say help, it certainly won't solve the entire problem. There are many other components that need to go into those types of operations and technologies onto the UAS to enable safe operations in more remote areas. The way we look at it, and this may not be solved immediately out of the gate, is remote ID, very similarly to how various tracking and identification technologies for manned aviation has permeated over the past several decades, will allow access to airspace in much more complex and much more dense airspace areas. And so that's ultimately kind of our long-term view of how remote ID is going to impact that. Of course, today, remote ID is going to help identify who's operating in airspace, but in the longer term, we see that potentially being able to help access airspace, just like ADS-B and radar has enabled us to operate IFR in dense urban airspaces all around the world. And so, although that may not be solved out of the gate, that's ultimately how we see remote ID being a stepping stone, working towards developing that safety case for access to much more complex and dense airspace.
Yeah. Tyler, thanks. That was a lot of information, and we may dive back into some of that, particularly when we talk about remote ID as enabling an alternative to air traffic control. John, I wanted to ask you if you could explain to us a little bit about how remote ID interacts with the idea of a UTM, or an unmanned traffic management system.
Yeah, and I think kind of the point I'd emphasize, kind of building off of Tyler, is this is very much a stepping stone, and there's a lot of assumptions and things that we need to solve for that go into this. I think one of the nuances, just looking at this diagram, is we have, again, a mix of regulatory and technology pieces that we shouldn't assume are going to work together. In the middle here, we have the USS, the UAS service supplier. That's an FAA process, just like Lance. And today, there's no actual sharing of Lance information. So I think it's a big assumption. I think that we're going to get that with remote ID. That's not in the rule. That's really for industry to solve, I believe, not on the regulatory side. So we need to have this sharing of data to really start to move into this UTM. And I think the way to think about UTM is it's not an enabler. It's something that needs to keep iterating, because UTM is ultimately needed at scale. We're not at scale. We have some of the same customers as Tyler and Precision Hawk and utility and energy, and they're scaling up, but they don't need real-time deconfliction and sharing of information. They're trying to start to scale. And I think, how do we have these stepping stones for UTM? We have Lance today. Let's start sharing Lance data. Remote ID is going to be great. We'll need to be able to share that data. Ultimately, the way I kind of think about remote ID is, I think it's going to be really hard to create those advanced operations, because the safety cases ultimately come down to what other aircraft can you see, not what information are you sending out so that others can see you. And that's a big distinction. We really need to solve for the latter to get true beyond line of sight. But in terms of a stepping stone, in terms of this iterative UTM that we're focused on building with other USSs, it's a great next piece of data. The thing that we really need to focus on unlocking is, how do we share that data amongst ourselves? Because if it's just siloed and sits with the FAA, it really only benefits that single person.
So John, you've raised a bunch of really interesting issues. So you obviously, sharing information is important. You've talked a little bit about UTM. I would like, maybe Trevor, you would respond to a couple of those items, particularly with regard to what is shared and isn't shared, what the privacy implications are, and what might need to happen for remote ID to really be an effective part of UTM. And the other thing I want to come back to, John, is you've raised the issue that there's really two sides to this equation, right? You said it's really important that we understand what we can see as operators rather than worrying about who can see us, right? And so it's really, it's both, right? Remote ID is a compliance piece where you're broadcasting so people can see you. And then the question becomes, who can see you, why can they see you, when can they see you, and is it sufficient to begin to build a UTM system, which is the question I think you're raising. But hey, Trevor, you want to jump in on a couple of those items?
Yeah, sounds good. I might focus on the deconfliction piece. That was an interesting piece that John brought up, and something we've been focused on as well. When you look at the remote ID standard, as far as what data is being shared and what data can be used to deconflict traffic, getting into the details, I mean, there's latitude and longitude are reported, but things like velocity and heading and things, other flight information that you'd need to really get to a UTM scaled up system where you're able to deconflict traffic, it's not quite there yet. And so when you're talking about, establishing airways in the sky or really scaling up urban operations, those are things that are going to have to be implemented, especially when you're dealing with, beyond visual line of sight flight, where you have to maintain see and avoid standards. The remote ID is one stepping stone to that, but it's really not going to solve every issue that we're having with that. We're still going to need some sort of detect and avoid system. The remote ID standard won't be good enough as written to just say, everything's cooperative. We don't have to worry about any other traffic. And then there's the question about how that data will be pulled in for manned traffic as well. How will actual pilots be using this data to maintain that UTM system overall? I don't think it's quite figured out. One good thing that the standard and the NPRM really did capture, though, is that identification piece. So, when a state wants to pull up traffic information, they should be able to do that. That data piece has to be figured out, of course, but I think getting that one stepping stone there to where they're able to manage traffic at a state and local level and a federal level is really how we're going to get there.
And if I can just jump in on that, I mean, I think, privacy is very important, obviously, to a lot of people. And I think, broadcast and network kind of address it two different ways. Kind of broadcast looks at, I think in the NPRM, it talks about, sharing a serial number. So it's not exactly like you're sharing your name and date of birth. But it is, it's a trackable number. Network remote ID has the advantage of, because you have this intermediary of a service provider, that service provider can kind of provide rotating, numbers for each vehicle. So the same vehicle may be reporting a different number every day. And it's still traceable, because it's been assigned by that service provider a different, number, but it allows for a little more anonymity than you would otherwise be able to have with the broadcast system. So there are some differences there. Network remote ID also has some limitations on how big an area you can access the information for as a display provider. And so there are limits in the standard for, I think it's about 2 kilometers. You can't get a box bigger than 2 kilometers worth of data. And that's specifically designed to help address some of the privacy issues of we not wanting, every drone in the whole country to be, trackable all the time by some company. And so I think that's important. Broadcast, because it's, limited by range, there are only so many receivers that could receive it. But as we've seen with ADS-B, it doesn't take long for, a series of hobbyists to put together a bunch of receivers and have nationwide coverage, which is why now ADS-B is starting to have more privacy issues because, pretty much every ADS-B equipped aircraft is tracked continuously across the country. So
that's a really interesting issue. Of course, ADS-B has a privacy mode. In most transponders, you can hit a button and it'll send a number that you can track, but so hopefully the aircraft there, but it doesn't necessarily identify your aircraft. And Ted, the use of privacy in the network version is very interesting. Mm-hmm. I've got a couple of questions that are coming up here, and I wanted to jump back to a couple of basic questions. Who has to use remote ID, and when are they likely to be required to use it in terms of the timeline for a rule and compliance?
I can grab that one. So pretty much any registered UAS has to use remote ID in some fashion, whether that's a hobbyist or commercial. If you're flying beyond visual line of sight or doing any advanced operation, you are going to have to use remote ID. One interesting thing about the standard that hasn't really been brought up yet, or the NPRM, I should say, is that the onus really falls on the OEM in the language that's in the NPRM now. So the manufacturers of the aircraft are getting most of the language that says that they're responsible for integrating the system, they're responsible for making sure that it's tamper resistant, they're responsible for making sure that there's a lockout mechanism so that, if broadcast isn't working, for instance, they can't take off and fly beyond visual line of sight. So that question hasn't really been answered, I guess, by the OEMs. I think that's still one of the big points, if you look at the comments within the NPRM, that OEMs are concerned about. That's a huge cost burden and potentially a technology issue as well. But the fact remains, as written, pretty much anyone flying a drone, unless they're in the FRIA area, as Ted said, is going to have to be remote ID equipped.
Right. Right. So that's a lot of people.
Yep.
We're talking about three different things, and I wanna ask one of you to clarify. So we're talking about a rule, which would be an FAA rule that everyone would have to comply with, and so we say the notice of public rulemaking is ultimately a draft version of that rule, and there were, I think, the FAA officer that spoke to us in the keynote mentioned the 53,000 comments that had to be adjudicated on that public notice. So there's a timeline for that rule. And then there are standards like this one that ASTM F38 has put out to help establish an industry consensus. And then there are actual technologies to implement this. So you look at the rule, you look at maybe an industry technical standard, and you say, well, we manufacture drones of this type. This is how we might comply as a manufacturer. So we're really through really important processes here. John or Tyler, do you want to jump in on what you expect to see a compliance path to look like?
Yeah, sure. So if I said that they're on track to publish a rule in December, I think while there were a lot of comments, I don't think we should expect anything different. We certainly had a lot of comments. Ours were published in TechCrunch if you want to look them up. But I think, as Trevor brought up, there's a lot of concerns around the hardware implication, not just from an OEM standpoint, but I would say from a privacy and ultimately remote pilot and command perspective. But regardless, I think the rule is going to look pretty much what was published already, and then it will be a multi-year timeline to roll this out. So it's nothing imminent. It's not going to pop into effect overnight, but something that in probably 3-ish years we'll start to see a lot more drones and services related to remote ID come into effect. Purely on the checking the compliance box, not the dashed orange line of how do we actually get to sharing data and displaying that for public or law enforcement purposes.
Right, yeah, multiple steps. Related to that, there's a question from the audience. Do the panelists think that remote ID will negatively affect widespread use of drones, especially for recreational flyers?
I don't think so. I think it's one of those things that you're going to have to comply one way or the other. I think it depends what kind of recreational flight. Ultimately, I think that was a big one, just given the fact that drones and model aircraft are now lumped together. It's certainly going to be harder to do what you can do today. Given the hardware element, if that sticks as it was written before. So it's going to be harder, just like getting a license plate's harder than just getting a car and driving it. So more steps, more cost, more everything. But if you love what you're doing as a hobby, I think you're going to be able to do it. It's just a little more work to get there.
Yeah, and I think, from my perspective, and we pushed back in our comments on the proposed rule. I mean, Aeros ended up putting in, I was just looking at it, 15 pages worth of comments. And one of them was to help relax those requirements to continue to enable drone, hobbyist drones and model aircraft, expanding the use of those FRIAs, the federally recognized identification areas, so that more places could be declared those, I think would really help. So, it wouldn't be too much of a burden to declare a hobbyist field, a identification area. I think this non-equipped network participant that we showed, here in the ASTM document didn't make it in the proposed rule. So maybe something like that would help keep the cost down. And then the other big thing is, I think it was mentioned earlier, the retrofit. Right now, the way the rule's written, the proposed rule's written, it was very hard to do sort of retrofit remote ID systems. And so we really pushed for, with a couple small technical changes, they could enable retrofits, where you could just strap on a little, box with 2 AA batteries and a little antenna, and off you go. So I think there's definitely some small changes, and we'll see in the final rule how it comes out, that could really reduce the burden on those hobbyists. At the same time, I think this is a huge enabling rule. You know, and there are a lot of barriers right now to beyond visual line of sight flight, to ops over people. And by having this remote ID rule in place, it kind of levels the playing field to allow those advanced operations while reducing the kind of fear from the general public about, you know, drones and, you know, being peeping toms and looking over, you know, at their pools and whatnot. By having this requirement to have remote ID, it hopefully reduces some of the public fears about drones and enables the more commercial, valuable operations to get off the ground and start happening without that kind of public pushback that we've seen over the last couple of years.
I think probably the other key missing piece, and Kraettli, I don't know if you have the slide that I just shared with you, but one thing that's in ASTM, and it's also things that we've demonstrated with the inter-USS is, and essentially this is what LANT is thinking about volumes. And I think this was kind of our approach. This was in our comments, but this would be a much more efficient and applicable way for hobbyists, commercial users, really with any aircraft, whether it's a drone, a model aircraft, to use volumes. It's a really safe approach. It gives situational awareness. It lets you comply with remote ID. Essentially think of it as LANTs anywhere. What if we just were able to say, hey, we're gonna be flying in this area. It doesn't need to be a FRIA. It doesn't need to be some special place. I think it's a key piece that I hope makes it into the FAA rule. It's part of the ASTM standard. I think it would go a long way to really enabling more people to comply, because I think that's ultimately what we want to get to. How do we get high adoption, high compliance without really sacrificing scale or having more people fly?
So, hey, John, this is a really interesting slide. Can you tell us real briefly what we're looking at here? And as you said, this functionality is not in the current proposed rule, but could be really useful. So if you can tell us real quick.
So I can go through this pretty quick. And I think really our approach was, let's focus less on the type of remote ID and more so what are we solving for. Getting into this broadcast versus network doesn't really get anywhere. We shouldn't really care. There's pros and cons. It depends how it's implemented. Let's focus on the use case and what we're trying to solve for. And so our suggestion was, let's have a 3-tiered approach. There's no hardware involved in this. Tier 1 is basically LANTs anywhere. Let me say I'm going to be flying in a certain area at a certain time, and that lets me take off. That lets me fly. That lets me check the compliance box of adhering to remote ID, and we know those volumes. Tier 2 was a little more advanced, where it says, hey, if you're able to share more information, specifically telemetry, about where that aircraft is using any of the standards, that you get more, essentially more room to fly. You can fly farther, you can fly higher as you share more data. Tier 3 builds on that, where it says, if you're sharing information not just about the aircraft and the volume, but also the operator, let's actually unlock beyond line of sight. So the main thing that we're focused on was volumes is a key enabler. This is what LANTs is. Let's build on LANTs, and let's think about how modelers can take advantage of this, FPV, all sorts of different types of unmanned operations can take advantage of volumes without getting into retrofitting and all of these other things that are really costly and would be a huge detriment. But again, this is in line with what industry's demonstrated, that we've demonstrated with Aerospace and others in the inter-USS, and what's in the ASTM. Yeah,
that's good stuff. I've got a couple of audience questions I want to make sure that we get to. I was wondering, Trever, maybe you can answer this. If not, someone else may jump in on this one. Is the law enforcement community generally satisfied with the rule that's been drafted?
Yeah, I'll answer this from my past role maybe. I think the major concern with the law enforcement community is the data that they're able to pull up from what's being reported from the remote ID standard right now. You know, for instance, there's no link to the Part 107 registration or any form of, I guess, ID, right? When Ted's talking about this anonymous ID that's issued, right now, you know, if a law enforcement officer was to go pull up their phone and say, hey, is this guy, you know, you can see he filed a flight and he's good to go, and he's squawking essentially. But as far as, you know, if he's a bad actor, how do you connect that with the person that's actually flying, I think is the major concern there. I think being able to locate where the operator is and his aircraft at the same time is a huge bonus. And there's a lot of positivity there, but I do think that there's some gaps that will hopefully be addressed in the final NPRM.
Interesting.
Yeah, and just if I can add one more thing, we're part of the FAA's UTM Pilot Program Phase 2, the UPP, and currently in Virginia, the Mid-Atlantic test site there, we're actually looking at doing another demonstration of remote ID and extending it to actually provide some of that additional information for law enforcement, doing kind of a prototype connection to the FAA's Part 107 database, actually the registration database, so the actual owner of the aircraft, trying to create some traceability there. So yeah, no, I think law enforcement is very interested and they see this as a step in the right direction. They just got to make sure that the final version is implemented such a way that it's useful for them and their workflows.
Yep. And then on the other side, I think there is still concerns about the, you know, for instance, ADS-B tracking. It's going to be the same thing with, you know, special flights or undercover operatives or things like that for law enforcement agencies that are actually using UAS as the operator. They need some capability to operate, you know, while using the remote ID and maintaining the regulations, but also not giving up certain positions or operations that they need to maintain privacy on as well. So
very, very interesting. It sounds like there's really there's many more capabilities that industry may bring to the table as possibilities that are in fact beyond the proposed rule. So that's just fascinating. There's another audience question I want to make sure that we get to. What are other nations doing around remote ID and these types of technologies? Do they have some kind of remote ID rule? Do any of you have exposure to some of those other rules and technologies?
Yeah, I think the Swiss is actually farthest along with implementing this, and I think one of the most interesting things, I think they had a press release a week or two ago, and in the stakeholders that they talked about as they implemented a version of remote ID was the citizens. How do we let people know that this drone is supposed to be there? We certainly see that with insurance customers, tower customers, energy. People are having aircraft far closer to them than they're ever used to, and it's a little bit foreign. They're not used to this. I know delivery companies are thinking about the same thing. How do we engage with the public? So I look at the Swiss for what they've implemented and really who they're looking to engage with.
That's very interesting. Let's see if we've got any other questions here. So one thing I am curious about is what do you all know about how the platform manufacturers are currently thinking about this in terms of when and how they might comply? It's a really interesting topic that remote ID is likely to be integrated in the platform. Maybe there'll eventually be a way to do an add-on afterwards. But what are you all seeing in the industry overall in terms of plans for compliance to this rule?
You know, from the perspective of more of a user in the space, one of the challenges that we're going to run into is figuring out how we can comply through some type of a third-party add-on in some case. You know, many companies, including ourselves, and many end users, such as the enterprise companies, have already invested millions of dollars into their fleets of aircraft. And so it's going to be very important to ensure that compliance can be made for remote ID through some form of add-on capability to the aircraft rather than reacquisition of new aircraft, which I think is going to be very important to figure out how that's going to work out.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, the ability to do, hopefully, with network remote ID, because it doesn't require any new equipment on the vehicle, is probably the cheapest way to implement this. Just requires software changes on the ground control station, plus an internet connection. Broadcast remote ID, like I said, sometimes some people, like as Tyler said, who already own aircraft want to have the ability to retrofit. And then I know, at least DJI has announced that they're looking at doing broadcast remote ID right out of the box, which makes sense. They already have, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi transmitters on board some of their aircraft. And so I would expect them and other manufacturers to start that, broadcast remote ID. The standards are mature enough now for them to begin to implement it. There might be some software changes on the required data elements. But at least from a hardware point of view, it can already be provisioned, and it's already starting to be provisioned in some of the DJI products.
Interesting. So we just have about 4 minutes to go, but we don't have to end exactly on time. This is a very interesting question. I think it goes back to something John said, but really relates to all of this that we're talking about. Are there currently barriers to sharing remote ID information between USS providers that are emerging? And what are those barriers and how are they going to be overcome?
Yeah, I think it's not really barriers, it's just more so it's undefined from a compliance perspective, and it's to be worked out by the fellow USSs to figure out. Again, if we look at Lance, there's no sharing of Lance data to date.
Right.
It's a one-on-one. You get an authorization, the FAA knows that, the USS knows that. So for Kittyhawk, we see about 50% of those. We don't see the other half. It'd be great if we could share that amongst us. But again, the FAA is not stepping in and saying, hey, how do we enable this? That's really for industry to figure out. So I think as you move to the right-hand side of this image with displaying remote ID data, I do not expect the NPRM to solve data sharing among USSs. We need to really think about that from a technology and industry perspective. Unfortunately, that's where lawyers get involved. That's where other things come into play in terms of how do we actually execute this in terms of liability, safety. But it's going to be a key piece that we need to solve. Otherwise, we're not going to have that experience at the right-hand side where you can look in an app and see who's flying if that data is not being shared and can be accessed across a USS network.
Right.
Yeah.
And
John,
that's really more of a UTM question. I just wanted to clarify, Ted, real quickly, that when we talk about data sharing, that has a lot to do with UTM. And if you look at the UTM standard that's emerging, maybe you'll see more of that.
Yeah, although remote ID is going to be our first implementation of this data sharing and this kind of network of service providers, depicted here in that orange cloud. And so just in Switzerland, John talked about they're kind of on the cutting edge of doing some of this remote ID, also doing, ASTM compliant network remote ID. They're looking at how do they structure the agreements between the service suppliers? Do they have one big service level agreement document that all of them sign on to? Do they do individual pairwise documents, which sounds like a mess? And to date, as John pointed out, the FAA has actually been kind of pushing against data sharing when it comes to Lance data, which has been kind of frustrating on industry's perspective. But because remote ID, in order for it to work, there has to be data sharing. Hopefully the FAA will act more like a facilitator and help, whether it's, templates of those sorts of agreements or, finding some way to help facilitate industry getting those legal agreements in place to share data, the faster we're going to have this working.
Ted, thank you for that. That's, I think, really interesting. We just have another few seconds here. Want to make sure that all the attendees know that they can go and look at the trade show booths after this. And then there will be an evolution of the IPP session, and also a tapping into federal research dollars to grow your UAS business. So those are both upcoming panels and discussions that will be going on. As we finish up here, I just want to give each of you the opportunity, if you can just give us a few sentences about what remote ID most excites you about remote ID as it likely emerges in December as a new rule as we go out. Trevor, you want to start?
Sure, yep. So, I mean, like I said at the start, we really see this as the first enabler to advanced operations. We've known for a long time it's going to be required. So we're working, as Tyler alluded to all the other pieces that are going to be required to get to those advanced operations at scale. We know remote ID has kind of been the holdup for a lot of them, including ops over people and beyond visual line of sight. So we don't have a dog in the fight, so to say, on the technology side for remote ID. We're kind of sitting on the sidelines and seeing how it plays out. And if there's a potential to integrate it potentially into like a hockey puck version or something for OEMs after, that's something that we're keeping an eye on. But I think if the language plays out how it's written now, a lot of it's going to fall on the OEMs. So just looking forward to figuring out how they're going to solve that problem.
Ted?
I guess I'm just looking forward to, implementing this as soon as possible. Like I say, this is a big enabler for those advanced operations for our customers and for the industry as a whole. So seeing the timeline of the remote ID and seeing if the FAA has included any sort of, voluntary equipage program to accelerate the equipage, I think that would be great to see.
Okay. Tyler?
Yeah, and similar comments as well. I look at this as really one of the first stepping stones that once this is solidified by the FAA, it allows the industry to continue to innovate, very similarly to what John showed with the volumes concept, to where we can continue to push the ball forward, propose more risk-based solutions to enable more advanced operations, and really continue the evolution of the UAS industry as we see it today and where we want it to be over the next 5 and 10 years. And so to finally have something solidified and to be able to move forward on and continue to build upon is really what I'm most excited about.
Excellent. And John?
Yeah, so for me, what excites me about remote ID has nothing to do with the FAA. There's a compliance piece that we'll all have to check in 3 or 4 years. That's fine. Remote ID from a technology and what it enables for an operation, for a fleet, for cities is far greater from a technology opportunity. And so that's really what we're focused on is let's actually develop more of this that is impactful today from an operation standpoint. And the compliance piece we'll hit that when we need to, but there's a lot of opportunity when it comes to aircraft talking to one another. So fortunately, we don't have to wait for the FAA to make that happen.
Right. Implement technology now. All right. Thank you all very much. We're going to wrap our session up. Thank you very much to our panelists for contributing your expertise and your really thoughtful approach to these emerging rules and technologies, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.